So in today's session, I would like to walk through a few things that is commonly requested, especially around enterprise architecture governance. Uh, and we'll be primarily focusing on various aspects that we take into consideration when implementing a governance framework for an architecture repository. That includes setting up a meta model and having rules and validations based on that meta model as the users create the architecture model. And then we'll also take a closer look at how EA will facilitate teams to define governance processes, including SLAs, standards, controls, and objectives. Then we'll take a closer look at how to do the change management using Sparx EA, especially EA 17, which is upcoming. There are quite a few features that has been added in EA 17 to facilitate effective change management. That includes enhancements to the time-aware modeling, a feature that has been in EA for a few versions now, but in the 17 version, it's been honed in such a way that it allows architecture teams to create the current state, the transition states, and future states in the same repository, and to be able to compare them and merge them as things evolve. So we'll be taking a closer look at two different approaches for maintaining like versions of your architecture using Sparx EA. Then we'll also take a closer look at how to set up the ARBs, the architecture review boards, and how to set up the roles for the ARBs, how to initiate a review or time one to happen every quarter, and how to consolidate the changes between various versions in the ARB and get the required approvals as things evolve. So this will be a gist of what we are intending to see in today's session. To start with, the first thing we always see teams is to create models using a standard. So Enterprise Architect is a multifaceted modeling tool, as you all know, and there is support for TOGAF and Archimate and Zachman and various other architecture frameworks. And teams try to model using one of these frameworks. However, what is also commonly seen or recommended is to arrive on a meta model that is usually a subset of these industry standards, but will help us achieve our intended use cases. So Archimate, for example, is quite popular, widely used, but it has a whole raft of things that could cover various aspects of enterprise architecture. But most teams start with some specific use cases in focus. So that could be achieved using a small subset of the Archimate framework. And enterprise architects configurability is one of its key strengths that allows users to define this subset and configure EA to work around this subset. And what we call that configuration in EA is an MDG, but that's a very technical term. Essentially, what we're doing is building a profile to conform to that meta model that you're agreeing on. And once that step is done, it kind of adds inbuilt validation and almost, I would say, guidance to the architects to create the right kind of artifacts with the right attributes and specific type of connectors between those artifacts. For example, I'll show in a moment how it actually differs from using a standard out of the box versus having a pre-canned environment which is catering to specific use cases. And all this will help us build a consistent model that can be interpreted by reporting tools and dashboarding tools to provide the required insights. That's where the key benefit is manifested. So to be able to create a consistent model, the ability to define a meta model plays a key role. And if you take a quick look at this, this is a sample enterprise architecture meta model that is supplied as part of our accelerators. This has various layers, and the difference between using out of the box Archimate, in this case, for example, I'm using Archimate and I'm trying to connect two application components. There is a half a dozen way of doing it, and similarly, I'm connecting a service to an application, and that again opens a number of options. So if we let users do whatever is offered out of the box, it is still perfectly fine, and people who are quite comfortable with Archimate will be able to figure out exactly what kind of connectors should be used in what scenarios, and they would. I mean, it should be perfectly fine. However, in most cases, a lot of people are usually coming from a Visio or a Draw.io kind of a background, and they sort of interpret it in a very basic manner, and they kind of assume it's a connector, and maybe don't give that kind of importance that Archimate emphasizes. So one way is to go train everyone in Archimate and come to a conclusion, but most of the times we end up in a locked room discussing whether it should be a function or a service or a capability and spend hours together without coming to a conclusion. So instead of getting down that kind of a discussion every time, the selected set of architects who is implementing this practice could agree on what should be used for what scenarios and zero in on one or two connectors that they would recommend to use, as opposed to opening the entire set of options that a standard offers. So instead of having these many connectors, which is Archimate standard, we could just zero in on a small subset. So instead of using Archimate out of the box, in this case, what I'm using is a profile that was built on a specific meta model. And what that will show is between two applications, there's only one type of connector that is prescribed. And that connector can also have its own meta data associated with it. For example, in integration, there are integration types and modes. And similarly, I'm connecting between an application and an actor, or an application and a role. It kind of make sure the direction is correct, the type of connector is consistent. So it is all implicitly validated, and that makes a big difference in building a consistent model in the first place. So, with that said, that is, in our opinion, the first and foremost thing to be able to, which is achievable with minimal efforts, but adds incredible value by helping teams create consistent models. And the second thing that we could use EA for towards governance is to define the governance processes themselves. So when we define the governance processes within the repository, again, we could use BPMN to do that quite effectively. We could set up the controls and objectives and workflows and pretty much everything related to governance set up in the same repository. So the documentation that the architecture team should refer to is pretty much within access anytime, and it's going to be live and it's updated as things evolve as well. So there could be the compliance processes, there could be the reporting processes, there could be the business control processes. So all these processes could be implicitly defined using the EA process modeling capabilities themselves. that makes sure like all the required documentation is also within the same repository. And then these are kind of the initial two steps that teams would expect to do, like configuring the meta model and then defining the processes around building and maintaining an architecture repository. And then comes the most important aspect, which is the change management. So, in terms of change management, as I mentioned in the beginning, there's been some significant improvements, especially in the upcoming EA 17, to facilitate change management and maintaining different versions of your architecture repository. And the two most prominent ways are one, to be able to model multiple versions of your architecture within the same repository. So, for people who already know, Enterprise Architect is a repository based modeling environment. There's a central repository on which the projects are created, the artifacts are modeled in it, and conventionally, there's been a limitation in maintaining multiple copies of the same asset. And that limitation was kind of leaving us with just one option, which is to maintain multiple repositories with identical objects, but having different states of it. So that was the only option left for us in the past. However, the improvement or enhancement to the time-aware modeling in the upcoming version will now allow us to create multiple versions of the same asset in the same repository and also be able to compare the different versions at any time and merge the changes back to one of the versions. For example, if you're taking a copy from the current state, modeling your transition states, you can always merge it back to the current state within the same repository. So that has been a significant improvement from what was previously implemented. So we were able to create clones in the previous version, but it wasn't it was pretty much separated from the original version and wasn't having that ability to be able to merge back. So that is a big difference that EA 17 has addressed. And the second approach is to maintain multiple versions of your architecture or branches in different repositories and then use what we call reusable asset service to manage the versions between these repositories. So we'll take a closer look at both these approaches, as a lot of discussions that I've had with users while implementing the best approach for change management, and both of these have been seen as acceptable approaches, especially with TAM being enhanced in the upcoming version. I personally believe there'll be more people who'll be using the time-aware modeling to achieve the same. So the time-aware modeling, again, was introduced a number of versions back, but there were some features that was not included in the original version that was limiting its application to maintain multiple states and merge them together. But in the version that's going to be made available now, it has changed, and that offers a significant benefit to people who are trying to do this. So a quick overview of how this works. You could have what we call clones or copies of your current state. So let me just enable what we call the timelines window. So there was a mention about timelines window in Tom's session when he introduced EA 17 as well. There's a lot of improvements along these lines, including maintaining a session history. So as you make changes to your repository or to your diagrams using EA 17, it will automatically keep saving your snapshots, and there are sessions that are persistent, snapshots that are persistent during a session, or if you save them, it will be persistent even beyond the session. So creating a baseline, which used to be like a two-step process in the past. So you should go to the baselines window and then create a new baseline. In the past, has been simplified to allow users to just say, save it as a snapshot or save it as a baseline at any point of time using this timelines window. And the same timelines window also has this, or the time aware modeling feature. And using that, what you could do is you could take a version of your model or diagram and create a copy. I mean, calling this as the transition state one, and it kind of creates a copy of this diagram, and I'm making changes to that diagram. I could add new elements, modify connectors, whatever, by creating local copies of those objects. So I'll only be creating local copies of the objects or connectors that are modified, and everything else remains the same. So in that way, it is not going to impact your current state architecture, but you're also not duplicating the entire structure either. So as I go and create current states and future states, or transition states and future state, and make different versions of it, Enterprise Architect will keep a track of all these. So I'm having pretty much like four different versions of a diagram. And then if I go to the original diagram and say show different versions of it, it will be quickly able to show what are the different versions of this diagram that's in flight. And you can also see here that EA keeps track of the different versions from the current state. So there is transition state 1, 2, and future state of this particular package or this diagram. So this kind of intelligence is what was missing in the past, and this ability that I'm going to show now to kind of look at different versions in parallel and to be able to merge them back was also missing, and it has been added in ES17. So I could just take, for example, the future state and say I want to compare this to the current state, and then it kind of shows me all the changes. Like the diagram merge and compare has also been improved significantly. It has made the performance has been improved significantly, and it's much faster than what it used to be in the previous versions. And once the compare is done and the merge is done, you could see that the changes from that particular version is now incorporated into the current state. So you could keep maintaining your current state or publishing changes to your current state as and when the changes in the future states are approved. But all of them are maintained within the same repository. That's where the key difference is. But then moving on to the second approach, which has been there, which is something that we've been doing for a while now. This is the way we've been implementing change management for Sparx EA customers in the past. However, some significant changes on this as well is around the model compare and merge. So technically speaking, it used to be working based on XML 1.x. This is just for the people who understand the technicality behind it. So it used to work based on XML 1.x. But Sparx EA introduced something called native XML, again in the last few versions. And the native XML export, import, and round trip is multi-folds faster than working using the 1.x or 2.x. And in EA17, the diff merge and comparison and the baselines and everything else around it, like timelines and snapshots, everything works based on the native XML as opposed to the 1.x. So this is the technical change. I mean, this is only for someone who kind of knows how it used to operate and have seen the limitations in using the larger XML formats. So that change has made a, a big difference and improved the overall experience in baselines merge and compare. So the second approach, which is managing multiple versions as branches and using RAS as the conduit in between to keep track of versions, is a very popular way of doing it as well, and this has also been enhanced significantly. So if you take a quick demo, in terms of a quick demo of how this RAS-based repository works, there is upfront setup that is required to make this happen. But that's more in the infrastructure side. From a user side, all you will see is there will be a reusable asset service, something like this, which is configured uh, between all the copies. So all copies will be able to connect to the same RAS. And what I'm doing here is I'm publishing my package or diagram as current state. And now I am accessing the same RAS from a copy or a branch of this model where I've made some changes. So just to show that I'm making some diagrammatic changes here, and then I can publish my updated version to the RAS, which will write another version to the same package or the same diagram. And I could keep doing the same from different versions or different copies of my model. So I've got two transition states and a future state repository. And what you notice here is as I've been publishing changes from different copies of my model. So again, this is the difference here. In the time-aware modeling, I was having one repository. I was just creating multiple versions of it within the same repository. But in the RAS approach, I've got a production EA database, and then I create a branch which is a copy of this database, and let me call it a transition state 1. Similarly, another copy called transition state 2, another copy called future state. So I've got copies of it. It doesn't have to be a full replica. It can be just the part of the repository which you would like to publish as a branch. So that is quite sophisticated. It's not like you need to copy the entire repository in another copy. You just can publish part of your EA repository as a new version and do the same. However, the key here is the RAS being the glue between these different versions. And you could see that I've got 1.1, 1.2, all the versions against application views that are accessible through the RAS interface. So the RAS interface now opens an opportunity for any of these copies, transition states or future states or current state, to see what the other project or team has done, and then you'll be able to compare to that version and selectively merge the changes. So that's again the key. So you'll be able to look at all the changes from different teams and merge them according to your preference or like approvals, and then you get the changes back to the current state. So just a quick recap. So there is like this way of doing versioning involves three or multiple copies. Like I said, there's a production version, but then there's a copy of it as branch one, a copy of it as branch two. I mean, when I say copy, I just want to emphasize that it's not necessarily a full replica. You could just have part of it exported or part of it copied as a new branch, but then it's all stitched together using the RAS for maintaining the versions and merge them together. And Prolaborate, which is the publishing portal, could handle this quite seamlessly as well. So I'll show you that in the next step, how the version explorer of Prolaborate will just mask all this complexity behind the scene and just show different versions like a toggle between version 1 and version 2. Um, we are trying to implement the version explorer. I mean, let me just take a closer look at version explorer and then come back and talk about the time aware modeling and version explorer. But before going there, there's also I could just introduce the reviews in Prolaborate, which is essentially what we are going to use for the architecture review board. But what we have done is when we are implementing it in the right way, we define the roles for ARB in my EA repository. Will clearly define who is part of which group, and then create a corresponding mapping for those roles within Prolaborate. And mostly this is connected to your SSO as well, so it kind of automatically onboards people to play the design authority role, or a local governance board role, or a global governance board role. So all these could be clearly modeled and implemented as user groups and connected to your SSO system, so that when people log in, they automatically assume the role and they get access to the reviews that has been set up for that role. So all these configurations are something that we do upfront to make sure it's quite seamless. And then we use the power of like reviews, like real-time reviews, as opposed to publishing it as a document, emailing it out to people, and going, a million iterations to get the right feedback. What we do is to have a real-time view of your diagrams and models, dashboards, and reports published as a review with an effective start date and end date, and assigned to a specific set of people or roles. And that kind of makes sure that people are involved with this, like in this review on a regular cadence. So you could have this review to be recurring on a specific time period. So you could have all those configured and then set up a review, which will, a quick example of how to set up a review. We could have, like, I'm calling this ARV, like for Q3, but you could have specific set of diagrams or parts of your EA repository selected to be included in this review. And then you could nominate groups or users who has to be invited for this review. And then once you set up this review, that's pretty much what it takes to send an email notification to every single person who has been invited to review this. So they'll be notified once the review starts, and they'll also be notified as the end date is near. So it's not just one email. There'll be a couple of emails to make sure it grabs their attention and invites them to participate in the review. And each of these reviews are associated, are kind of assisted with specific dashboards. So there is a moderator dashboard, which is what I'm looking at. So this is a dashboard that someone who initiated this review will get to see. So they'll be able to see what each of the invited reviewers are up to, any open comments that they have, the priority or criticality of those comments is also visible, and a click on each of these will take them to the right diagrams with the right comments open. So pretty much a consolidated view of all your review comments are available in a single place. And the same applies to a reviewer as well. So the moment a reviewer accesses the model, either through and by clicking a link that is sent to them as an email, or by clicking on an in-app notification that says, this is what you need to, you've been invited to participate in a review. Uh, Either way, so clicking from an email or clicking this in-app notification will automatically take them to the reviewer's dashboard, which kind of highlights all the diagrams and artifacts that has been included in the review. They could preview, they could look at the diagram, they could take a closer look at its attributes and details as well, and then either approve it or sorry, either approve it or quickly post a comment which serves as a review feedback. So they could go ahead and say, I'm fine with it," or like, review done, or add a comment which kind of gets consolidated as a review comment under the review. It is persistent, so the review comments are all um, grouped under the review and stored against the diagram or the artifact on which it was posted as well. So come 6 months later, if you want to understand what where the comments are kind of led to all the changes happening, you would have that history persistent in Prolaborate. So against a EA diagram, against an EA artifact, you'll always see a history of all the changes and all the comments that happened over several reviews. And that's a unique advantage as well. And now we're kind of going into maintaining multiple states and reviewing multiple states. So I'm just jumping or like opening a diagram here, which is the CRM payment and other services diagram. And you could see there is a current state and transition state toggle. So this is what I referred to when I said the publishing portal masks all the complexity behind the scene. So the first two approaches is something that only the architecture team has to figure out and establish a way to do it. But once that's done, from a reviewer's perspective, they'll be oblivious of whatever approach you're using behind the scene. For them, it's just a matter of toggling between different versions in Prolaborate to just see how things are changing. So I'm here in the current state. Oops. I'm here in the current state, and then I'll be able to just see the transition state or other states as well, and also see the differences between them. And you can make a comment or add a feedback based on what is today and what you're expecting from transition state one as well. So it's you're always informed. So you're not making any comments by just looking at one version of it. So you have that sophistication to look at multiple states at the same time, and then have a comment that kind of takes all these in consideration. The reason I'm emphasizing this is it's all about information gap. So the users may be looking at one version of it, but at the same time there's another team who is trying to address the concern that he is about to raise. So an ability to toggle between all these versions and see what's happening and then make an informed comment saves a lot of time for the reviewers and for the architecture teams as well. So that's the ability to look at multiple states. And then there's also an approver role. So most of our users have established a two-phased review approach. So there's a review cycle where more people are invited and they all share their comments to incrementally develop the models. But then once all the review is done, we have an approver work flow as well. Mostly it's the DEAs, the design authorities, who play the approver role, and they would not really add any comment, but just either approve it, or of course, if they give a feedback, it's going to be something that's notified to every single reviewer as well. So now, last addition to it, this is an optional add-on. Only if the AI component is enabled will this work. But what this does is we've seen reviews getting bigger very quickly. So I'm just demonstrating an example with a handful of rows here. But in reality, there's going to be a whole lot of people involving in ARBs, architecture review boards, and the AI assistant that we have developed, if enabled in your system, will be able to make this process a little simpler as well. So using the AI assistant, you'll be able to get a summary of whatever has been discussed in a review. So for example, what this just demonstrated is there's a whole raft of comments between Beth and Andy and Dave, and I'm just here saying I would like to get a summarized view, and then the AI will be able to process it and give me a summarized view of all the discussions. This is just a usability feature, but plays a key role because the AI assistant could also be used to summarize a response as well. This is just a added item. But in summary, the architecture review boards using the publishing portal that sits right on top of Enterprise Architect repository and be able to read the different versions is quite an advantage. Now, to answer one question which already has been asked in yesterday's discussions, would the Prolaborate review support the time-aware modeling versions? The answer is it must. I mean, it should, but we are just one version behind Enterprise Architect. So as EA 17 is going to be released now, the next version of Prolaborate, which will be out, will support the time-aware modeling in the version Explorer as well. So that's just a note. So in summary, in this session, what we went through are the common configurations that we do. So there are two ways our users start. So one, they try to figure it out themselves, or they try to implement the best practices that they have been using for a while and do it themselves. And most of them get all these right because there's enough documentation support from our side as well. But then there's also teams who start from scratch or would like to do things with our assistants. And whenever we have assisted teams to set up a practice from scratch, these are all some of the steps that we have done. Of course, the time aware modeling based change management is new, but everything else that I spoke about here is something that we repeatedly do to make sure everything else is in place. So setting up a really good meta model and having a central repository where people could collaborate is all fantastic, but we also need a strong governance underneath to be able to make sure the models are consistent, it's reviewed in the right time, the changes goes through an approval process, and all the changes and comments and feedback are kind of stored and documented for future reference. So all these are what we looked at in these 5 steps, and that's pretty much what I want to show.
Thank you, Nizam. So, we do have some questions posted here. I would like to go through one or two questions over here in the session. So, there is one question from Aaron Brown. With the time aware, how would the tool rationalize, find related objects? Often we search to find what things are affected by a change. But with time aware, how would it know to show me things future state or not future state?
Okay, that's a really good question. So when we use the time-aware modeling, and if I'm having an application or an asset that is going to be modified in a future state, I would create a local copy. I mean, EA calls it a local copy. Essentially, what it is a version, a new version of the asset, and make these changes only in that new version. So if I'm creating some new connectors or adding new tag values, it is not going to impact the current state asset, but it's only going to impact the copy. So when I do find related elements or traceability or anything of that sort, that will only show me the contents relevant to that particular state. So if I'm doing it in version 1.1, it will only show me things around version 1.1 and its changes.
Thank you for the explanation, Nizam. So the rest of the questions will be posted in the Slack platform since it requires some more explanation. And thank you once again, Mohammed Nizam, for the comprehensive presentation on enterprise architecture governance using the Sparx Architecture Platform. Your deep dive into the governance controls, processes, and best practices has been incredibly valuable. To our audience, we hope today's session has sparked new ideas and will help you strengthen your own architecture governance strategies. For any remaining questions, feel free to continue the conversation on our Slack channel, where Nizam and our team will be available for further discussion. Up next, we have an exciting session on achieving full governance of your enterprise architecture specifications with Sparx EA by Gustavo Sabio. We look forward to having you all join us for that. There is more to come, so stay tuned for the upcoming sessions. Thank you.